They looked up and saw something they could never unsee: lights, shapes, and shadows that defied every law of the sky. But the real terror came afterward, when the silence of power fell heavier than the mystery itself. They say the night hides more than it reveals, and sometimes the shadows are not empty at all. This is where our story begins, not in the blinding daylight of headlines and history books, but in the hours after midnight, when silence grows thick and the air feels alive with the weight of things unspoken. These are the Midnight Files, the accounts of men and women who saw what they should not have seen, who heard what they were never meant to repeat. The government calls them unidentified aerial phenomena, a term that sounds sterile, almost harmless. But to the witnesses, there was nothing harmless about what they encountered. Some saw strange lights darting across the sky faster than any aircraft known to man. Others watched in awe as massive shapes hovered silently above them, blotting out the stars. And a few came close enough to feel heat, to hear hums, to walk away with burns that no doctor could explain. What happened next was often more terrifying than the sighting itself. A knock at the door in the dead of night. Strangers in black suits who knew too much about where you lived and what you had seen. Threats whispered in quiet voices, promises of ruin if you ever spoke again. For some, it was not strangers, but their own government superiors who dismissed them, ridiculed them, or buried their reports in locked cabinets, never to be seen again. The scars are not just on paper. They are etched into lives, families fractured under the strain of ridicule, careers ended for daring to tell the truth, health destroyed in the aftermath of exposure to something beyond understanding. And worst of all, the endless question that gnaws at every witness long after the lights vanish: why me, and why was I allowed to see what others are forbidden to know? This is not a story of little green men and harmless folklore. This is a story of power, of silence enforced with fear, and of people caught in the middle of something vast and secret. Some of these cases made headlines before they were quickly explained away. Others never left the shadows, passed only from whispered witness to reluctant investigator until the trail went cold. But the witnesses remain. Decades later, their voices still carry the tremble of memory. Their eyes still hold the reflection of impossible things. Many wish they had never spoken at all. Some paid dearly for daring to break the silence. And a few are no longer here to tell their side, their voices lost to mysterious deaths, accidents, or despair. The Midnight Files are their legacy, hidden truths, suppressed testimonies, glimpses into a reality our world is not ready to face. As you listen, know this: every story you will hear is more than a tale. It is a wound, carved into human lives by encounters with the unknown, and by the governments that chose fear over truth. And in the silence that follows, you might wonder, as they did, what is out there, and why are we not allowed to know? It began in the summer of 1947, on a lonely stretch of ranchland outside Roswell, New Mexico. A storm had passed through the night before, and when the rancher rode out to check his sheep, he found the ground littered with debris unlike anything he had ever seen. Shards of strange metal that would not bend or burn, thin sticks that looked like wood, yet could not be broken, symbols etched in colors that shimmered when they caught the sunday. He touched the fragments, tried to twist them, even struck them with a hammer. Nothing behaved as it should have. Word spread quickly in the small town. Neighbors came to see the wreckage. Some pocketed small pieces, turning them over in their hands like tokens from another world. Soon the military arrived, soldiers with orders and tight expressions. Trucks rolled in, fences went up, and what had once been a rancher's curiosity became the center of something darker. The first announcement was bold, an official release declaring that a flying disc had been recovered. Newspapers printed the story in wide letters. For one fleeting day, the impossible was spoken aloud. But by the next sunrise, the statement had been withdrawn. The wreckage, they now said, was nothing more than a weather balloon. The same men who had sworn otherwise were suddenly silent, their eyes downcast, their words clipped. For those who had seen it with their own eyes, the silence was unbearable. Neighbors whispered about soldiers showing up at their doors, warning them not to talk. Families who had handled the debris were told to forget what they had touched. Some did as they were told, afraid of losing their land, their jobs, or worse. Others kept the memory alive, but only in hushed tones, behind closed doors, with the curtains drawn. Decades later, the survivors still remembered. The rancher who first discovered the wreckage told friends he had never seen anything like it before or since. Military personnel, once bound by duty, confessed in old age that what they carried out of Roswell was not from this earth. But their testimonies came at a cost. Labeled as liars, attention seekers, or senile, many lived the rest of their lives under the shadow of ridicule. Roswell became a legend, a punchline, a tourist attraction. But for the witnesses, it was never a joke. It was the moment when the sky itself seemed to split open and drop a truth they were not allowed to keep. What they saw was taken from them, and in its place, they were given silence, confusion, and fear. The Roswell survivors carried their secret until the end, the weight of what they had seen pressing against their hearts. And even now, their voices linger in fragments of testimony, in family stories passed down, in the trembling words of men and women who dared, at last, to tell the world that something extraordinary fell from the sky that summer, and that the truth of it was buried under layers of denial. On a cold January afternoon in the year 1948, the skies over Kentucky became the stage for one of the earliest and most haunting tragedies of the modern UFO era. Captain Thomas Mantell, a young pilot in the Kentucky Air National Guard, was scrambled with 3 other 51 Mustangs after reports of an enormous unidentified object hovering high above the horizon. Witnesses on the ground described a metallic disc, shining like silver, drifting in and out of the clouds. Some said it was larger than any plane they had ever seen. Mantell and his wingmen climbed steadily, straining both their aircraft and their vision to chase the strange craft. The other pilots soon fell behind, limited by the oxygen available at that altitude. But Mantell, determined and confident, pressed higher, ignoring the danger of thin air. His voice crackled over the radio as he described what he saw. Something vast, something bright, something not of ordinary design. Then his transmission broke into static. Moments later, his plane spiraled out of control, plunging into the fields below. By the time rescuers reached the wreckage, Mantell was gone. The crash site was a scene of confusion. His plane was shattered across the ground, the cockpit crushed, and yet no clear reason explained the sudden loss of control. His fellow pilots, shaken, recounted his last words and the glimpse they had of the object that seemed to defy explanation. The Air Force moved swiftly to close the case. At first, they suggested Mantell had been chasing the planet Venus, mistaking its glow for a craft. Later, the explanation shifted. Perhaps it had been a secret balloon from a classified Navy project, drifting where it should not have been. But the witnesses on the ground rejected these tidy answers. They had seen something too large, too close, too deliberate in its movements. And those who heard Mantell's final transmissions could not reconcile them with the idea of a distant planet or a drifting balloon. In the weeks that followed, Mantell's death became a cautionary tale whispered among pilots. Some were told not to speak of it at all. Others repeated the official story while privately admitting they believed something else had happened that day. For Mantell's family, there were only questions. Why had he been sent so high without proper oxygen equipment? Why did the story of what he was chasing keep changing? And what exactly had their son seen in the final moments of his life? Decades later, the Mantell tragedy remains one of the earliest and clearest warnings of the danger that came with confronting the unknown. It showed how quickly the official story could shift, how silence was imposed on those who saw too much, and how the cost of curiosity could be measured in human life. Captain Thomas Mantell's name is remembered not only as a casualty of the Cold War skies, but as one of the first witnesses to pay the ultimate price for chasing something that should not have been there at all. In the anxious years of the 1950s, when the Cold War's shadow stretched across every sky, the United States Air Force began what it called Project Blue Book. Officially, it was meant to study reports of unidentified flying objects, to collect data, and to separate fact from fiction. In reality, it became something far stranger, a project caught between curiosity and control, where investigators who looked too closely often found themselves silenced. Thousands of reports poured in from ordinary citizens, farmers, police officers, pilots, even military personnel. Lights that darted against the wind, disks that hovered over fields, massive objects that blocked out the stars. Some files contained photographs, others recordings, and still others were nothing more than trembling voices describing what they had seen. At first, a few investigators approached the work with open minds. They logged the details carefully, noting patterns, mapping locations, even daring to suggest that some of these encounters could not be explained away as balloons, stars, or weather phenomena. But those who leaned too far toward the truth quickly learned that their careers were at risk. Men who wrote too boldly in their reports found their conclusions rewritten before being filed. Some were quietly reassigned to distant bases, their investigations abruptly halted. Others were told directly by commanding officers to stop wasting time on fantasies. The goal of Blue Book, many realized, was not to uncover what was in the skies, but to reassure the public that nothing was there at all. There were whispers within the project of missing files, cases so compelling that they vanished into locked drawers before anyone could follow them further. Radar operators who tracked impossible speeds, pilots who described craft performing maneuvers no human aircraft could survive, civilians who suffered burns and sickness after close encounters. These reports were marked, classified, and then quietly removed. What remained in the official records was watered down, stripped of urgency, and dressed up with explanations that rarely matched the testimony. Some of the men who worked under Blue Book carried their unease for decades. A few, late in life, admitted what they had suspected all along, that the real investigation was happening elsewhere, behind closed doors, in offices they were never allowed to enter. Blue Book, they said, was little more than a public mask. Its purpose was not discovery but dismissal, to keep the world calm while someone else decided what truths were safe to know. For the investigators who had begun with honest intent, the silence was crushing. They knew they had glimpsed something extraordinary in those forgotten files, something that suggested the phenomena were real and persistent. Yet they were forced to file their reports under weather, stars, or imagination. The truth was buried under the weight of bureaucracy, leaving behind only frustration and suspicion. Project Blue Book officially closed in 1969. The Air Force declared the matter settled. Nothing of defense interest, nothing unexplained. But the men who handled those files knew better. They had seen the reports vanish, the witnesses silenced, and the evidence hidden. And long after the project ended, the question remained, burning in the back of their minds: what truths lay buried in the forgotten files, and who decided they were too dangerous to be revealed? In the sweltering summer of 1952, the skies over the nation's capital became a stage for one of the most unsettling spectacles in American history. For several nights in July, radar screens at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base lit up with mysterious blips. They darted, they hovered, they vanished only to reappear in impossible places. Controllers stared in disbelief as objects performed maneuvers no known aircraft could match. Pilots were scrambled. Fighter jets roared into the night, chasing lights that danced just out of reach. Some pilots reported glowing orbs that streaked past their cockpits before vanishing into the clouds. Others saw nothing at all. though the radar confirmed they were surrounded. The contradiction only deepened the fear. Whatever was up there seemed to decide who would see it and who would not. Word of the sightings leaked into the press, and soon the story was splashed across front pages nationwide. Headlines screamed of flying saucers over Washington, the very seat of American power. The public demanded answers. Behind closed doors, officials panicked. The idea that unknown craft could violate restricted airspace above the Capitol for multiple nights without being intercepted was a nightmare scenario. Radar operators and pilots who witnessed the events firsthand were pulled aside, questioned not just by their superiors, but by intelligence officers. The questions were pointed. What did you see? What exactly did you say on the radio? Who have you told? Some were reminded of their duty, warned to choose their words carefully. Others were pressured to accept explanations that did not match what they had experienced. Temperature inversions, they were told, could cause false radar returns. Stars and meteors could play tricks on the eyes. Yet the men who had spent years watching those screens and flying those skies knew better. They were not fooled by weather. They were not chasing Venus. For some, the interrogation left scars that never healed. Careers stalled. Reputations crumbled under whispers of unreliability. A few carried the burden of knowing they had seen something extraordinary, but were forbidden to admit it. In quiet moments, they spoke of the paranoia that followed them, of feeling watched, of receiving visits from men who insisted they stay silent. The Washington Flap of 1952 remains one of the most dramatic UFO events ever recorded, not only because of the sheer number of witnesses, but because it unfolded in the heart of power itself. If unknown craft could appear and disappear above the Capitol, what else was possible? The official explanations calmed the public for a time, but those who lived through those nights never forgot the blips on their screens, the lights in the sky, and the cold stares of the men who demanded their silence. For them, the invasion was real, and the fear it left behind never truly faded. It was the final nights of December in the year 1980, when the frozen stillness of Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, England, was shattered by a glow that seemed to pulse between the trees. At the nearby Royal Air Force Base at Woodbridge, leased to the United States Air Force, alarms were raised. Security personnel, thinking a downed aircraft had crashed in the woods, set out to investigate. What they found would follow them for the rest of their lives. Through the cold and mist, strange lights flickered, red and blue, moving with a precision no helicopter or plane could mimic. The men crept closer, their boots crunching on frost, their radios hissing with static. And then they saw an object on the forest floor, metallic, triangular, glowing faintly as if alive. Its surface seemed etched with markings unlike any they had ever seen. Some of the men reached out to touch it, their hands brushing symbols that burned into memory. The next day, radiation readings were taken at the site. Instruments spiked far above background levels, concentrated in a neat circle where the object had rested. Even the trees bore scars, branches broken, bark seared. Animals in the area grew restless, their cries filling the night. This was no fallen aircraft. The second night brought more witnesses. Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt led a team into the woods, armed with tape recorders and Geiger counters. His voice, still preserved on that recording, carried the tremor of disbelief as he described lights splitting in the sky, beams shooting down to the ground, and a brilliant orb maneuvering between the trees. "It is coming this way," he muttered into the recorder. "This is unreal." But when the reports reached higher command, the story changed. The official line dismissed the sightings as nothing more than misidentified stars, distant lighthouses, or even the burning of farm equipment. The men who had been there were told to forget, to move on. Some laughed it off in public, but in private, they carried the weight of what they had seen. A few pressed too hard, insisting their testimony be taken seriously. Those men soon found their careers derailed, their reputations stained. The cost of speaking out was heavy. Years later, The Rendlesham witnesses would break their silence, telling their stories despite ridicule and doubt. They described not just lights in the woods, but the lingering sense that something intelligent had been there, watching them, testing them. Even skeptics who visited the site could not deny the burned marks in the soil, the radiation readings, and the consistency of testimony from trained military men. For the airmen who stood in that forest, the memory was not a tale of mystery but of intrusion, a night when the world they knew was peeled back, and something incomprehensible looked through. And when they tried to tell the truth, they discovered another reality, just as frightening, that their own government would rather destroy their lives than admit what happened among those silent trees. On a warm September night in the year 1976, the skies over Tehran became the setting for one of the most chilling aerial encounters ever recorded. Residents across the city looked up and saw a glowing object hanging in the dark, brighter than any star, shifting colors and moving with impossible speed. Calls poured into the Iranian military, and soon the order was given to scramble jets. What followed was not a routine patrol but a confrontation with something that made seasoned pilots question everything they knew. The first fighter closed in quickly, but as the pilot prepared to engage, his instruments flickered and died. Radar went blank, radios cut to silence. Even the weapons systems froze, as if a hand had reached inside the machine and switched everything off. Shaken, the pilot broke off pursuit, and the moment he turned away, the controls sprang back to life. It was as though the craft had chosen to let him go. A second pilot was sent, one of the most skilled in the Iranian Air Force. As he approached, the glowing object suddenly released a smaller sphere that darted straight toward him. His heart pounded as he tried to fire, but again, his weapons refused to respond. Every attempt to lock on was jammed. The smaller object closed the distance, then abruptly veered away, climbing back into the larger craft before both shot upward and vanished into the night sky with a speed no human aircraft could match. The pilots landed trembling, their accounts detailed and consistent. Ground radar had tracked the objects as well, confirming what the men had seen. This was no illusion, no star or planet mistaken for something more. The evidence was solid, and the shock spread quickly through the chain of command. Within hours, American intelligence was alerted. Documents later revealed that U.S. officials classified the Tehran encounter as one of the most credible UFO cases ever studied. The reports noted the reliability of the witnesses, the radar confirmation, and the electromagnetic interference that disabled advanced jets mid-flight. Yet the deeper the Americans became involved, the quieter the case grew. Files were locked away, access restricted, and the public explanation, if one was ever given, was nothing more than silence. For the Iranian pilots, the night never ended. Some were haunted by what they had faced, machines stripped of power by something unseen, their lives spared only because the object chose not to finish the chase. They carried the memory like a scar, proof of forces that could outfly, outmaneuver, and outthink even the sharpest human pilots. The Tehran dogfight remains a ghost in the official record, a case that military analysts admitted they could not explain, yet never allowed the world to fully see. And for the men who soared into that glowing unknown, the memory was not of triumph but of helplessness, a reminder that sometimes the hunter in the skies becomes the prey, and that even the strongest nations bend to secrecy when the impossible appears above their cities. In the year 2014, off the coast of Chile, a Navy helicopter lifted into the sky on what should have been an ordinary patrol. The pilots on board were seasoned men, trained to scan the horizon for smugglers, unidentified aircraft, or anything out of place. That afternoon, they carried with them an advanced infrared camera, the kind that reveals what human eyes cannot see. What they captured would become one of the most baffling and unsettling UFO encounters of modern times. Through the infrared lens, the crew spotted a strange object flying low over the ocean. At first glance, it seemed like a distant aircraft, but no transponder codes appeared on their instruments, and no radar picked it up. The object moved with purpose, gliding smoothly, then accelerating at angles that defied ordinary flight. The helicopter followed cautiously, recording everything. Minutes into the pursuit, the object did something extraordinary. From its body, it expelled a thick plume of material, a kind of energy or vapor that spread and then vanished into the sea air. The pilots watched in disbelief as the strange craft released not once but twice, as though it were spraying something invisible to the naked eye. Yet, on infrared, the emissions glowed with intensity, undeniable and real. The crew tried to contact ground control, but there was no record of any authorized aircraft in the area. Civil aviation confirmed nothing should have been there. Still, the unidentified object moved calmly, almost indifferently, as though unconcerned about being followed. For nearly 10 minutes, the helicopter tracked it until it finally disappeared into the horizon, leaving only the eerie footage behind. When the recording was reviewed, shock rippled through the Chilean Navy. The images were clear, the signatures undeniable. This was no drone, no commercial plane, no weather balloon. The object had defied the rules of flight, and the emissions it released were unlike anything they had encountered before. At first, the footage was kept internal, classified, locked away. The pilots who had witnessed it firsthand were quietly instructed not to speak of what they had seen. Whispers later surfaced that foreign officials, including American intelligence, had shown a keen interest in the case. Files were requested, meetings held behind closed doors, and the men who captured the footage were left with the sinking feeling that what they had seen no longer belonged to them. For years, the recording sat hidden until a civilian investigative group within Chile's own government finally pushed to release it to the public. When the footage became known worldwide, skeptics scrambled for explanations. Some called it a leaking aircraft, others a glitch in the camera. But for the pilots who lived the moment, the memory was more chilling than any official dismissal. They knew what they had followed that day, and they knew the silence that was demanded afterward. The Chilean Navy encounter became not just a piece of evidence, but a warning, proof that even when the truth is caught on film, those who see it are often left with nothing but orders to forget. In the winter of 1989, a strange wave of sightings swept across the skies of Belgium. It began quietly, with reports from small towns of massive triangular objects moving slowly, silently, and impossibly low to the ground. Soon, police officers themselves began to call in what they were seeing. These were men trained to remain calm, men used to dismissing superstition, but now they described hovering craft, each one shaped like a perfect triangle, with brilliant lights at its corners and a central beam that pulsed downward into the night. As weeks turned into months, the sightings multiplied. Thousands of witnesses, from farmers to city dwellers, all spoke of the same thing. The Belgian Air Force could not ignore it. They ordered their radar stations to sweep the skies, and what they found sent chills through the chain of command. Unknown objects were tracked moving at speeds no known aircraft could achieve, suddenly stopping mid-flight, then shooting off again at right angles that would have crushed any human pilot inside. On one night in March of 1990, fighter jets were scrambled. Pilots chased the triangular objects as they darted across Belgian airspace. Radar confirmed what their eyes already told them. Targets appeared and vanished, locked on one moment, gone the next. Pilots reported chasing lights that accelerated beyond Mach speeds within seconds. Some admitted privately that it was like chasing ghosts made of metal and light. Police officers on the ground gave sworn statements. They described being nearly underneath the objects, close enough to see details of the underside, panels and lights that looked deliberate, crafted. Families in their cars pulled to the side of the road just to watch as the silent giants moved overhead. It was not a handful of witnesses, it was entire towns looking up in awe and fear. Yet when the official explanations arrived, they were insulting. Authorities suggested misidentified helicopters weather balloons, or even mass hysteria. But the men who had seen the craft with their own eyes, the radar operators who had tracked impossible maneuvers, and the pilots who had chased them through the night skies knew better. The explanations did not match the evidence. Some who spoke too boldly were quietly warned to stop. Police officers who gave interviews suddenly refused to say more. Radar data that had once been discussed openly became classified. Military spokesmen brushed the matter aside as if nothing unusual had ever happened. For many of the witnesses, the silencing was almost worse than the sighting itself. They were told to deny what they had seen, to carry the memory like a burden that could never be spoken of without ridicule or consequence. To this day, the Belgian Triangle remains one of the most credible mass sightings in history, supported by testimony from trained observers and radar evidence alike. And yet, those who stood beneath the massive black craft were forced into silence, left with the knowledge that truth had been buried not by mystery alone, but by human hands determined to keep it hidden. In December of 1965, astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell were orbiting Earth aboard Gemini 7, part of the mission that would prove humans could survive long stretches in space. The world listened in awe as their voices crackled across radios, updates delivered with the calm precision expected of men trained to face the unknown. But amid the reports of fuel readings and orbital adjustments came a phrase that still stirs whispers decades later. Lovell's voice, half casual and half amused, broke through. "Please be informed that there is a Santa Claus." To the public, it sounded like a harmless joke, a festive remark during the holiday season. But to those who knew the coded language of astronauts, the words carried a different weight. For years, pilots had used Santa Claus as a stand-in term for unidentified flying objects, a way to acknowledge the presence of something extraordinary without sparking panic on open channels. The timing, the tone, and the context left many wondering what exactly had the crew of Gemini 7 seen drifting alongside them in the cold silence of space. Rumors spread quickly through the space community. Some insisted the astronauts had spotted booster debris or reflected light from nearby equipment. Others whispered that what they saw was no part of the mission at all, but an object that appeared and disappeared with the same unnerving calm described by pilots back on Earth. Whatever it was, Lovell's remark was not repeated or explained. The coded phrase passed into history, half dismissed as humor, half remembered as revelation. Inside NASA, questions were raised quietly. Astronauts were professionals, bound by discipline, but they were also human beings staring into the endless dark, confronted by shapes and lights that often defied explanation. Several would later admit, in private or with cautious words, that they had seen things they could not explain. But in the 1960s, as the Cold War pushed the space race into overdrive, secrecy ruled the day. Public acknowledgement of UFOs by astronauts would have been unthinkable. Careers, missions, even entire programs could have been jeopardized. For Lovell and Borman, the phrase became a ghost that followed them for years. Journalists asked, researchers speculated, but neither man ever gave a definitive answer. The words remained suspended in static, a fragment of mystery preserved in the annals of spaceflight. To this day, believers hold that Gemini 7's Santa Claus was more than a joke. They see it as a glimpse behind the curtain, a moment when trained astronauts, men of science and courage, acknowledged something extraordinary in orbit with them. And when they spoke of it, even in code, the response was silence, not denial, not clarification, just silence. In that silence lies the weight of every story like it, the suggestion that some truths are too vast, too disruptive, to ever be explained to the public. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Apollo missions carried men farther from Earth than any before them. Millions watched the grainy broadcasts as astronauts walked upon the lunar surface, their voices echoing through television sets around the world. Yet, there were stretches of silence that the public never questioned, periods when the spacecraft moved behind the moon and radio contact was lost. NASA explained it as simple physics. The bulk of the moon blocked the signal. But whispers began to spread that those blackouts carried secrets never meant for ordinary ears. Insiders later spoke in hushed tones about what may have happened during those gaps. Some claimed that the astronauts continued speaking, not into the public channels, but into secure lines reserved for classified reports. The stories vary, but the themes are strikingly similar: lights on the horizon, strange structures visible against the gray dust, objects moving where none should exist. A few even insisted the astronauts were not alone on that barren world. One tale that refuses to fade is the rumor that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, during Apollo 11, reported unidentified craft watching them from the crater's edge. According to the whispers, their words were captured on a backup channel, cut from public transmission. "They are here," Armstrong was said to have muttered. Official transcripts contain nothing of the sort, yet the rumor has lived on, repeated by technicians, contractors, and anonymous voices who claimed to have monitored private feeds. Other missions were said to encounter the same unsettling presence. Apollo 17, the last crewed journey to the moon, had a 4-minute gap in communication that conspiracy theorists cling to. NASA called it a technical glitch, but believers argue that something extraordinary was witnessed and swiftly removed from record. The astronauts themselves rarely addressed the rumors directly, yet their silence only deepened the intrigue. For those on the inside, the price of speaking openly was high. Some contractors who claimed knowledge of classified transmissions reported visits from stern officials warning them to remain quiet. Careers ended abruptly. Files vanished. A veil of secrecy seemed to cover not just the missions but the very memories of the men who lived them. To skeptics, these stories are nothing more than myths spun from gaps in communication and the natural human need to fill silence with wonder. To believers, the silence itself is evidence. Why else would moments of missing audio become so fiercely guarded, so carefully dismissed? The truth, they argue, lies not in what was said, but in what was deliberately withheld. The Apollo blackouts remain one of the great shadows of space exploration. Whether the astronauts witnessed nothing at all, or glimpsed something beyond imagination, the fact remains that parts of their journey will forever be hidden. And sometimes, what is not said speaks louder than any transmission ever could. In September of 1991, the Space Shuttle Discovery lifted into orbit on mission STS-48. It was meant to be routine, a scientific flight studying the upper atmosphere, nothing more. But in the stillness of space, as the shuttle glided high above Earth, the onboard cameras captured something that no one on the ground was prepared to explain. During a live NASA feed, viewers watched as small points of light appeared in the blackness beyond the shuttle. At first, they looked like distant stars, faint and unremarkable. Then, they moved. One streaked across the screen at an angle, another followed, shifting with speed and precision. A sudden flash, like a burst of energy, erupted from the edge of the frame, and the objects darted away as if in response, accelerating in sharp, unnatural trajectories. It did not look random. It looked deliberate, almost evasive. Within hours, the footage was being replayed by analysts and enthusiasts alike. Engineers inside NASA raised quiet questions. If those objects were ice particles, as some officials quickly claimed, why did they change direction after the flash? Why did their movements defy the predictable drift of debris in microgravity? The more they examined the video, the less the simple answers seemed to fit. Yet those who pushed too hard for clarification found doors closing swiftly. The explanation from NASA was terse. Ice, thruster firings, camera perspective, end of discussion. Meetings where the footage was mentioned grew tense. Some engineers later admitted they were warned not to speculate publicly, not to associate their names with what outsiders had begun calling proof of UFOs in orbit. Careers could be ruined with a single careless statement. The video, however, refused to disappear. Copies circulated beyond official channels, landing in the hands of independent researchers who dissected every frame. They argued the flash resembled a directed energy burst, perhaps a test of space-based weaponry, with the objects reacting intelligently to avoid it. Others insisted the objects themselves were under control, maneuvering with a precision beyond human capability. For the astronauts on board, silence was the chosen response. None spoke openly about the lights, and their reports stuck strictly to mission objectives. Yet, those who had watched the raw feed live swore the crew knew something was unusual. The quickness with which NASA dismissed the event only fueled suspicion that more had been seen and more had been said than the public would ever hear. The STS-48 footage remains one of the most debated pieces of space anomaly evidence ever captured. To skeptics, it is nothing but drifting ice. To believers, it is a glimpse of a hidden war in the heavens, or proof that we are not alone, watched even in orbit. But the truth may lie not in what the video showed, but in how swiftly those who questioned it were silenced. The lights danced in the void, then vanished, leaving behind not answers, but the echo of secrecy. In September of 1991, the Space Shuttle Discovery lifted into orbit on mission STS-48. It was meant to be routine, a scientific flight studying the upper atmosphere, nothing more. But in the stillness of space, as the shuttle glided high above Earth, the onboard cameras captured something that no one on the ground was prepared to explain. During a live NASA feed, viewers watched as small points of light appeared in the blackness beyond the shuttle. At first, they looked like distant stars, faint and unremarkable. Then, they moved. One streaked across the screen at an angle. Another followed, shifting with speed and precision. A sudden flash, like a burst of energy, erupted from the edge of the frame, and the objects darted away as if in response, accelerating in sharp, unnatural trajectories. It did not look random. It looked deliberate, almost evasive. Within hours, the footage was being replayed by analysts and enthusiasts alike. Engineers inside NASA raised quiet questions. If those objects were ice particles, as some officials quickly claimed, why did they change direction after the flash? Why did their movements defy the predictable drift of debris in microgravity? The more they examined the video, the less the simple answers seemed to fit. Yet those who pushed too hard for clarification found doors closing swiftly. The explanation from NASA was terse. Ice, thruster firings, camera perspective. End of discussion. Meetings where the footage was mentioned grew tense. Some engineers later admitted they were warned not to speculate publicly, not to associate their names with what outsiders had begun calling proof of UFOs in orbit. Careers could be ruined with a single careless statement. The video, however, refused to disappear. Copies circulated beyond official channels, landing in the hands of independent researchers who dissected every frame. They argued the flash resembled a directed energy burst, perhaps a test of space-based weaponry, with the objects reacting intelligently to avoid it. Others insisted the objects themselves were under control, maneuvering with a precision beyond human capability. For the astronauts on board, silence was the chosen response. None spoke openly about the lights, and their reports stuck strictly to mission objectives. Yet those who had watched the raw feed live swore the crew knew something was unusual. The quickness with which NASA dismissed the event only fueled suspicion that more had been seen and more had been said than the public would ever hear. The STS-48 footage remains one of the most debated pieces of space anomaly evidence ever captured. To skeptics, it is nothing but drifting ice. To believers, it is a glimpse of a hidden war in the heavens, or proof that we are not alone, watched even in orbit. But the truth may lie not in what the video showed, but in how swiftly those who questioned it were silenced. The lights danced in the void, then vanished, leaving behind not answers, but the echo of secrecy. In November of 1986, Japan Airlines Flight 1628 was making its long-haul journey from Paris to Tokyo. High above the icy expanse of Alaska, the seasoned crew suddenly found themselves staring at something they could not explain. Captain Kenju Terauchi, a veteran with thousands of hours in the air, saw lights in the distance that grew closer, brighter, until they dwarfed his Boeing cargo jet. Two glowing objects flanked his plane, maneuvering with a precision that mocked gravity, while a larger craft, immense and looming, seemed to trail just beyond. Terauchi reported what he was seeing to ground control. Anchorage radar confirmed a target, but then lost it, as though the sky itself was playing tricks. The pilot described the larger craft as so vast that it was hard to measure, like a floating city made of light. His voice, steady but strained, was recorded as he tried to make sense of the impossible. For over half an hour, the encounter continued, the strange objects shifting positions around his jet before finally vanishing into the darkness. When the flight landed safely, the ordeal was far from over. Terauchi gave his account openly, submitting detailed reports to both Japanese and American authorities. At first, it seemed he would be believed. Radar operators had seen anomalies. Controllers had heard his words in real time, but soon the tide turned. Officials dismissed the incident as pilot confusion, optical illusions, or atmospheric effects. The credibility of a man who had flown safely for decades was quietly dismantled. Terauchi was grounded not long after, removed from active duty on the claim that he had overreacted. His career, once honorable and steady, collapsed under the weight of ridicule. He was later reinstated, but the damage was done. The message was clear. Speak of such things and you will pay the price. His story is not alone. Over the decades, countless commercial pilots across the world have described luminous objects pacing their aircraft, sudden intrusions into controlled airspace, and craft that defy every law of aerodynamics. They filed reports, often reluctantly, because silence is safer than honesty. Those who did speak up frequently faced investigations, psychiatric evaluations, or quiet transfers that ended promising careers. Passengers, too, have occasionally glimpsed the unexplained, corroborating what pilots described, yet the narrative rarely reached the public unscathed. Airlines and aviation authorities had little interest in stoking fear among travelers. Better to call it weather, or static, or reflections from the glass. Better to bury the testimony of men and women who spent their lives navigating the skies. For pilots like Captain Terauchi, the memory of what they saw never faded. They knew their instruments had not lied, that their eyes had not betrayed them. The terror was real, as was the price of telling the truth. Above the clouds, where human skill meets the unknown, silence became the only safe co-pilot. And those who broke it learned that the skies hold more than mysteries, they hold consequences. It was a cold December night in the year 1980, when Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and Vicki's young grandson Colby were driving home through the pine forests of Texas. The road was dark, the air still, when a blinding light appeared ahead. At first, they thought it was a helicopter or plane in trouble, but as they drew closer, the sight grew stranger. Hovering above the treetops was a massive diamond-shaped object, glowing with a fiery brilliance. Flames licked from its base, and the heat radiating from it was so intense that it seemed to set the road itself shimmering. The three stopped their car, unable to move forward. Betty stepped out, shielding her face, and felt the burning heat press against her skin. The object roared like a furnace, tilting as though it struggled to maintain control. Then, in the distance, the sound of helicopters filled the night. Dozens of them, Chinooks, twin-rotored and unmistakable, swarmed around the glowing craft, circling it like escorts or pursuers. The scene looked more like a military operation than an accident of the sky. When the object finally drifted away, escorted into the darkness by its helicopter convoy, the witnesses were left shaken but alive. Yet within hours, the true horror began. Betty developed blisters on her skin. Her eyes swelled. Her hair began to fall out in clumps. Vicky and little Colby suffered similar burns, nausea, and weakness. Doctors later confirmed that their injuries resembled radiation exposure, as though they had stood near a reactor without protection. The women sought answers, but none came. They filed reports, pressed authorities, and eventually brought a lawsuit against the U.S. government, convinced that the military had been involved in whatever they had seen that night. Yet the case was dismissed. No branch of the armed forces admitted to flying helicopters in that area. No record of the incident was acknowledged. Official silence was their only reply. As the years passed, Betty's health declined sharply. She endured surgeries, illness, and pain that never eased. Vicky, too, bore the scars, her life permanently altered. Even young Colby, though he had seen less, carried lasting effects. Their pleas for recognition, for some measure of justice, were met only with denial. The Cash Landrum case remains one of the most disturbing civilian encounters ever recorded, not only because of the extraordinary sighting, but because of the aftermath. This was not a fleeting light in the sky or a radar blip. This was an encounter that left physical evidence etched into human flesh. And yet, the government stood firm in silence, dismissing their suffering as though it were nothing. For the witnesses, the memory was seared as deeply as the burns on their skin. They had seen something powerful, something dangerous, and they had been abandoned to face its consequences alone. In the shadows of official denial, the truth of what happened that night still lingers burning, unanswered, like the craft that scarred them. On an October night in the year 1973, a U.S. Army Reserve helicopter lifted into the sky over Mansfield, Ohio. It was a routine training flight, 4 men aboard, all disciplined National Guard pilots and crewmen. The air was calm, the night uneventful, until one of them spotted a red light on the horizon. At first, it looked like an aircraft approaching on a collision course. The crew adjusted their heading, expecting it to pass. Instead, the light grew larger, brighter, and impossibly fast. Within moments, the object was upon them. The red glow became a massive cigar-shaped craft, its surface dark but crowned with a dome of green light that pulsed like something alive. The pilots yanked at the controls, dropping altitude to avoid a collision, but the craft mirrored their movements, descending with them as though locked in pursuit. The helicopter plunged nearly 1,500 feet in seconds, the crew straining against gravity, but the object followed, closing the gap. Then, in an instant that none of the men would ever forget, the glowing craft stopped directly above their helicopter. The cabin flooded with an intense green light, bright enough to blind, humming with an energy that made the air itself feel heavy. The pilots reported that their instruments spun wildly, the altimeter dropping even as the helicopter seemed to hang in place, caught in something they could not control. Just as suddenly, the light vanished. The object shot upward into the night sky, gone in a heartbeat. The helicopter, freed from its grip, steadied itself. The crew, shaken but alive, looked at one another in disbelief. These were trained men, experienced in the skies, and all 4 told the same story. They filed their reports with military precision, describing what had happened in exact detail. At first, their testimony was taken seriously. Investigators interviewed them, even acknowledging the credibility of their accounts. Civilian witnesses on the ground had also seen strange lights that night, corroborating parts of their story. But soon the tide shifted. Explanations began to surface: misidentified planes, reflections, even hallucinations. The crew found themselves dismissed, their reputations quietly questioned. Captain Lawrence Coyne, the lead pilot, insisted for the rest of his life that what he saw was no illusion. He was not a man prone to fantasy. He was a soldier, a professional, and he carried the memory of that night until his final days. For him and his crew, the ridicule stung almost as much as the encounter itself. The Coin helicopter incident remains one of the most credible UFO cases on record, not only because of the training and integrity of the witnesses, but because of the sheer terror in their voices as they recounted being caught in the green glow of something beyond human design. For them, the skies of Ohio were no longer safe, and the silence that followed only deepened the mystery. In March of 1997, the skies over Arizona became the canvas for one of the largest mass sightings of unidentified craft in modern history. It began in the early evening, as families gathered in backyards and drivers filled the highways. From the north, a formation of lights appeared, 5 brilliant orbs arranged in a perfect V, moving silently across the desert sky. Witnesses said the craft was enormous, so large it blotted out the stars as it passed overhead, gliding slowly and deliberately as though it were surveying the earth below. Reports flooded emergency lines. Thousands of people, police officers, pilots, parents, children, watched as the formation traveled from Nevada through Phoenix and on toward the south. Some described a single massive craft with lights along its edges. Others saw independent glowing spheres, but all agreed on one detail. What they witnessed was no conventional aircraft. The silence of it, the scale, the impossible grace of its movement, it was unlike anything human hands had built. Yet when officials were pressed, the story changed. The military announced that the lights were simply flares dropped during an exercise at a nearby training range. For some, that explanation was enough. But for the thousands who had seen the lights hover for minutes at a time, or watched the craft's immense body blot out the night sky, the flare story rang hollow. Flares do not travel in formation across an entire state. They do not block the stars above. Those who dared to challenge the official line soon found themselves ridiculed. Reporters labeled witnesses as hysterical or deluded. Prominent officials laughed it off, most memorably the Arizona governor at the time, who held a press conference where a staff member, dressed in an alien costume, was marched out as a joke. The crowd laughed, the headlines mocked, and the credibility of thousands was reduced to a punchline. Years later, that same governor admitted privately that he too had seen the massive craft and had been deeply unsettled. He confessed that the mockery had been an attempt to calm the public, but for the witnesses, the damage was already done. Careers, reputations, and even friendships crumbled under the weight of disbelief. Some were branded as cranks, others learned to stay silent, burying the memory of what they had seen to avoid humiliation. Still, the Phoenix Lights remain one of the most documented and undeniable mass sightings in history. Video footage exists, testimony runs into the thousands, and yet the truth has been buried beneath ridicule and dismissal. For those who stood under that vast, silent craft, the experience was unforgettable. They knew what they saw, and no amount of laughter or smear could erase the image of lights gliding across the desert night, an image that still haunts Arizona's skies to this day. In the early 1980s, the quiet suburbs and wooded hills of New York's Hudson Valley became the stage for a spectacle that shook entire communities. Families gathered on porches, commuters pulled their cars to the side of the road, and whole neighborhoods stood in silence as massive objects drifted slowly overhead. They were described as enormous, sometimes triangular, sometimes boomerang-shaped, outlined in brilliant lights that glowed against the night sky. The craft moved silently, so large that witnesses said they could see no end to them, as if the very heavens had been carved into shadow. It began in 1983, with hundreds of reports streaming into police stations in a single night. Some callers trembled as they spoke of a hovering craft with rows of lights that seemed to linger for minutes before vanishing without sound. Officers who investigated saw it too, and many admitted they could not explain what hung above them. At times, traffic along major highways ground to a halt as drivers abandoned their vehicles just to stare upward. For years, the sightings continued, wave after wave of appearances stretching into the late decade. Witnesses were not just isolated individuals but entire families. groups of strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, all describing the same thing. Some reported beams of light shining down into fields. Others swore they felt a low hum resonate through their bodies as the craft passed. The sheer number of reports, spread across so many towns, left little room for simple dismissal. Yet, as the stories grew, so too did the shadows that followed them. A number of witnesses later whispered of strange visits, men in dark suits who arrived unannounced, asking pointed questions. They carried no official badges, no clear authority, but they spoke with quiet menace, reminding people that talking too openly about what they had seen could lead to trouble. Families who had once spoken freely soon grew silent. Neighbors who had laughed together under the same hovering lights began to look over their shoulders. The official explanation that eventually surfaced claimed the sightings were nothing more than small planes flying in formation, their lights creating the illusion of a massive craft. To many, this felt like an insult. Pilots and engineers among the witnesses dismissed the idea outright, insisting that no group of planes could mimic the silent enormity they had witnessed. And for those who had endured visits from unmarked cars and men in black coats, the explanation seemed less like an answer and more like a cover. The Hudson Valley wave faded by the end of the decade, but the memory lingered in the communities it touched. Parents still tell their children about the nights when the sky seemed to bend open, when neighbors stood side by side staring upward in awe and fear. For some, the strangest part was not what they saw above, but what came afterward, the quiet warnings, the unmarked visitors, and the realization that the mystery in the sky was matched by the one standing at their front door. In May of 1949, James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense of the United States, was found dead after falling from a hospital window. The official story called it suicide, the tragic end of a man suffering from exhaustion and mental strain. But for decades, whispers have lingered around his name. Whispers that tie his fate not only to politics and power, but to secrets, far stranger secrets, involving unidentified flying objects. Forrestal had been one of the most powerful men in Washington during the turbulent years following the Second World War. He oversaw the creation of the modern defense establishment, and he was privy to the nation's deepest military secrets. Colleagues described him as tireless and sharp, but also as a man who grew increasingly troubled by the weight of what he knew. Some claimed that Forrestal had developed a keen interest in the reports of flying saucers that had begun flooding in after the war. He allegedly pressed for greater transparency, believing the public had a right to know that something was intruding into American skies. By 1949, Forrestal's health was said to be failing. He was admitted to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he was kept under close watch. Officially, he was being treated for stress and depression, yet the manner of his confinement raised questions. He was placed in a high-security ward, his visitors tightly controlled. According to some accounts, he confided to friends that he feared he was being silenced, not healed. He spoke of being followed, of people listening, of forces determined to keep him quiet. In the early hours of May 22nd, Forrestal's body was discovered on the third-floor roof of the hospital after he had fallen from a 16th-floor window. A bathrobe sash was tied around his neck, torn as though it had been used as a garrote. The official investigation concluded suicide, citing his fragile state of mind, but for many, the details did not add up. Why had a man under watch been left alone in the night? Why had documents he kept been seized immediately afterward? Why did some who knew him insist that he had been on the verge of revealing something monumental? Over the years, theories multiplied. Some claimed Forrestal had learned too much about a secret program dealing with UFOs, perhaps even about recovered craft or non-human technology. Others suggested he had stumbled too close to truths that the government was not ready to admit. His death, in this telling, was not an act of despair but an act of removal, a silencing dressed in the language of tragedy. Whether Forrestal was a victim of his own exhaustion or of something darker, His story remains one of the earliest and most unsettling intersections between power, secrecy, and the UFO mystery. To those who believe, his fall was not just from a window, but from the heights of truth into the shadows where it was meant to stay hidden. Phil Schneider was not a man easily ignored. A geological engineer and defense contractor, he claimed to have worked deep within secret facilities hidden beneath American soil. In the mid-1990s, he began speaking publicly about what he said he had witnessed underground bases where human forces and non-human beings allegedly coexisted, sometimes in uneasy alliance, sometimes in violent conflict. His lectures drew crowds, his words carrying both technical detail and a sense of desperation, as though he knew he would not be allowed to continue for long. Schneider told audiences that he had been injured in an underground firefight at Dulce, a rumored base beneath New Mexico. He spoke of strange technology, of advanced weapons, and of a hidden world the public was never meant to see. He displayed scars on his body. Wounds, he said, were proof of encounters that no official report would ever confirm. To some, he was a prophet of hidden truths. To others, he was delusional. Yet his passion and specificity made it difficult to dismiss him outright. As the years went on, Schneider's tone grew darker. He claimed his life was in danger, that government agents had already tried to silence him. He warned that if he were ever found dead by suicide, it would not be by his own hand. He repeated this warning often, as though he wanted to leave a mark that could not be erased. His lectures became less about revelation and more about survival, each one sounding like both confession and farewell. In January of 1996, Schneider was found dead in his apartment. A cord was wrapped around his neck in a way that suggested strangulation, not self-infliction. The official cause was ruled suicide, yet for those who had listened to his warnings, the conclusion felt like a cruel echo of the fate he had predicted. Friends and family insisted that he had been silenced, that his death was staged to discredit him. His documents, they said, had gone missing, his notes and evidence vanishing in the days after his body was discovered. The grim circumstances of his death only amplified the mystery. If Schneider had fabricated his stories, why had his end mirrored the very threats he had long described? If he had been mentally unstable, why had so many of his claims aligned with rumors whispered for decades about secret bases and hidden technologies? And if he had spoken the truth, what forces had moved to ensure his silence? Today, Phil Schneider remains a figure caught between myth and martyrdom. For believers, his fate is the ultimate proof that those who reveal too much about the hidden world of UFOs and government collusion do not live long. For skeptics, his story is a cautionary tale of obsession and paranoia. But either way, the manner of his death casts a long shadow, one that refuses to fade. In the end, Schneider's life ended as he had warned it would, abruptly, violently, and under circumstances too strange to dismiss. The stories begin the same way. A witness sees something extraordinary, a craft hovering in the night sky, lights that move against every law of flight, a presence that leaves no doubt it was real. They tell a friend, maybe a family member, and before long, word spreads. That is when the knock comes. Always unexpected, always late, the sound of a hand at the door that changes lives forever. Standing outside are the men in black. Witnesses describe them as almost human but not quite. Their suits are too perfect, their speech too precise, their eyes dark and unblinking. They arrive in unmarked cars that gleam as if fresh from the factory, engines purring in silence. No license plates, no trace of origin. When the men step inside, the air grows heavy. They do not shout, they do not argue. Instead, they speak softly, with words that carry the weight of threat without ever needing to say it outright. For some, the torment begins with questions. What did you see? Who have you told? Do you have photographs or drawings? Then comes the warning. Forget it. Do not speak of this again. Others tell of more sinister encounters. The men in black seemed to know intimate details of their lives, things they had never spoken aloud. They hinted at consequences for families, careers, even sanity itself. Some witnesses left those meetings shaken, too frightened to ever speak of their encounter again. The psychological toll was immense. People who once swore they would share their story began to unravel, plagued by paranoia and sleepless nights. Some reported being followed, their phones clicking with strange echoes, their homes visited more than once. A few described the men in black as less than human. Their skin waxy, their movements stiff, their voices mechanical. They said it was as if they were wearing a disguise of flesh, as though something else entirely stood beneath the tailored suits. Officially, of course, the men in black do not exist. There are no records of their visits, no files that confirm their work. Skeptics dismiss the accounts as folklore born from fear, yet the stories stretch back decades, from the 1950s through the 1990s and beyond, across continents and cultures. Always the same details, always the same quiet menace, too consistent to be coincidence. For those who endured their presence, the damage was lasting. Lives were ruined, marriages strained, careers destroyed by whispers of madness. Some took their stories to the grave, never daring to risk the shadows returning. Others tried to fight back, only to be drowned in ridicule and silence. The men in black are less a question of belief and more a lingering wound. If they are real, they represent a machinery of secrecy far beyond ordinary government. If they are not, then how do so many people tell the same chilling story? Either way, the truth is written in the fear etched on the faces of those who answered the knock and found their lives changed forever. In the shadow of the Cold War, when the race for weapons and secrets stretched into every imaginable frontier, the Central Intelligence Agency turned its gaze inward into the mind itself. The project was called many names over the years, from Stargate to Grill Flame, and its purpose was strange even by intelligence standards. The goal was to train men and women to use remote viewing, the supposed psychic ability to see across distances, to peer into locked rooms, military bases, even across oceans. At first, the targets were earthly: Soviet submarines, missile silos, hidden laboratories. But soon, the viewers began reporting things that no one had expected. Session after session, descriptions emerged of objects in the sky, metallic craft that hovered silently, structures on the moon and Mars, and beings that did not resemble humans at all. Some reports were laughed off as imagination, but others were so consistent, so detailed, that they unsettled the very people who had commissioned the work. Remote viewers sketched disks with domes, triangles floating in the atmosphere, even underground hangars filled with machines that defied explanation. Those inside the program were torn between fascination and fear. Was the human mind truly touching something real, or were they slipping into delusion? For the participants, the distinction became hard to see. Some were praised for their accuracy when their descriptions matched intelligence gathered later by satellites. But when the visions turned toward alien craft, the atmosphere in the program darkened. Whispers spread that the viewers had stumbled into territory not meant to be uncovered. Several participants later spoke of psychological strain, of nightmares that followed them long after their sessions ended. One viewer claimed he had encountered not just craft but the presence of entities aware of being watched. He described a sudden feeling of intrusion, as though the gaze of his mind had been met by another, stronger gaze staring back. After that day, he unraveled, haunted by a sense that he had been marked. Breakdowns were common. Some left the program shattered, unable to separate reality from vision. Others insisted until their last days that what they had seen was genuine, and that the government had buried the most troubling findings. Files declassified years later confirmed the existence of the program, but the pages that might have revealed the most startling details were heavily redacted. What remains hints at something extraordinary: government-sanctioned psychics describing alien technology and encounters that no one in authority dared to explain. The remote viewing project was officially shut down in the 1990s, dismissed as unscientific and unreliable. But for those who had looked too deeply, the damage was already done. Some were left broken, others silenced, and a few continued to whisper of what they had seen. To them, the program was not a failure, it was a brush with truths hidden beyond both the sky and the mind. And the cost of touching that truth was a descent into shadows from which many never returned. In March of 1967, deep in the frozen plains of Montana, something happened that rattled the United States Air Force to its core. At Malmstrom Air Force Base, crews monitored the nation's most dangerous arsenal nuclear missiles, standing silent in underground silos, always ready, always guarded. On an otherwise ordinary day, alarms began to sound. Not just one, not two, but a series of missiles suddenly went offline. Within minutes, an entire flight of weapons, enough to destroy cities, was rendered useless. Above the silos, security personnel reported strange lights. They described glowing orbs hovering silently, shifting in ways no helicopter or jet could replicate. Some hovered low over the gates, bathing the ground in eerie light. Others darted away with blinding speed, as if surveying the missile fields from above. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Just as the unidentified craft appeared, the missiles went dark. When the craft vanished, the systems remained disabled until they were manually restored. Officers scrambled to investigate, but they were met with something colder than the Montana night silence. Men who had sworn oaths to protect their country now found themselves sworn to secrecy, ordered to say nothing of the incident. Reports were buried, files locked away. Those who pressed the issue, insisting that this was no coincidence, were warned their careers would not survive such talk. Some were reassigned. Others found their reputations quietly eroded, their credibility questioned until they had no choice but to fall quiet. Decades later, a handful of those men finally spoke out. Former launch officers described the event in detail, confirming what had long been whispered in the halls of secrecy. They admitted that the shutdown was real, that it happened under circumstances no earthly technology could explain. They described the fear not only of the unknown craft, but of the realization that someone, or something, had reached into the heart of America's nuclear arsenal and switched it off like a child flicking a light. The implications were staggering. Whoever controlled those objects had the power to neutralize humanity's most destructive weapons without firing a shot. Was it a message, a warning, or something more sinister? The officers themselves could not say. What they knew was that their silence had been demanded, their truth denied, and their names left to fade while the mystery lingered above the silos. Officially, the Air Force has never admitted that the Malmstrom shutdowns were connected to UFOs. They cite technical malfunctions, systems errors, coincidences, but for the men who were there, who watched lights dance above secure facilities as nuclear warheads blinked offline, the memory is carved in stone. They were witnesses to a force that could disarm a superpower without touching a button, and they were punished not for failing to protect their weapons, but for daring to speak of what they saw. The silence became the final command they were ordered to obey. In the final days of December 1980, the U.S. Air Force presence at the Bentwaters and Woodbridge bases in England was thrust into a mystery that never loosened its grip. For the men on the ground, it began with strange lights in Rendlesham Forest, objects that defied description, and instruments that spiked with radiation. But the deeper story was not only in the woods, it was in the offices where commanders were forced to carry a truth they were never allowed to admit. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, then the deputy base commander, was among those who walked into the forest with his men. He carried a tape recorder, capturing his voice as he described lights darting between the trees, beams shooting down from the sky, and an object that seemed to split and multiply before his eyes. His tone was steady but edged with disbelief, the voice of a soldier trying to stay calm while witnessing the impossible. Yet, when the reports reached higher command, the pressure began. The official explanation pushed to the public spoke of a nearby lighthouse, of misidentified stars, of overactive imaginations. But the men who had been there knew better. Their commanding officers knew better too, yet they were ordered to stand behind the story that stripped their experiences of all credibility. Halt himself was instructed to minimize what he had seen, to treat the event as little more than a curiosity, not an incursion. For some commanders, the silence became a wound. Privately, they admitted the reports were serious, that the consistency of testimony from trained airmen could not be dismissed. Radiation readings had been taken, marks on the ground had been documented. Even British authorities had quietly acknowledged that something unusual had occurred, and still, the weight of secrecy pressed down. To admit the truth would be to invite ridicule, or worse, to open questions about what forces had breached one of NATO's most secure installations. Over the decades, as younger men spoke openly about what they had seen, those in command remained cautious. A few allowed themselves brief glimpses of honesty in interviews, admitting the event was real but still cloaking their words in careful language. Others avoided the subject entirely, their silence itself a testimony to the pressure that had been applied. Some carried the burden into retirement, haunted not only by what had happened in the forest but by their role in denying their men the validation they deserved. The Bentwaters incident is remembered as England's Roswell, but for the commanders caught in its shadow, it was something even darker. They had seen what their men had seen. They had felt the same chill when the beams of light cut through the trees, yet they were forced to wear masks of skepticism, to betray their own memories for the sake of policy. The lights faded from the forest long ago, but the silence remained, a command heavier than any uniform they had ever worn. In the late 1980s, the name Bob Lazar slipped into the public's imagination like a spark on dry grass, igniting stories that would never fade. He claimed to have worked at a secretive site near Area 51, a place called S4, where he said 9 otherworldly craft were hidden in hangars carved into the mountainside. According to him, these machines were not of earthly design. They bent gravity itself, powered by a strange element that mainstream science did not even recognize at the time. Lazar described the craft with an engineer's precision. He spoke of reactor cores, of propulsion systems that created fields no human technology could replicate. His story was not the vague rambling of a dreamer, but the detailed account of a man who had stood inside the machines. He said he had seen them fly, silently and effortlessly, turning at angles that would have crushed any human pilot. It was testimony that, if true, meant the government had long been hiding technology that could alter the fate of civilization. But telling his story came at a price. Lazar's past was ripped apart in the press. His educational records were erased, his employment history disputed, his reputation dragged through mud. Colleagues who once supported him grew distant, friends turned cautious. Some whispered that his life had been deliberately dismantled to discredit him, to make sure no one would believe his claims. Others said he was a fraud who had fabricated his past. Yet despite everything, Lazar never wavered. He stuck to his story year after year, insisting that what he had seen was real. He was not the only one. Others who whispered of strange projects near Area 51 spoke of reverse engineering alien technology, of hangars filled with craft that hummed like living things, of materials that defied the known laws of physics. Some were anonymous, their accounts leaking quietly into books and late-night radio shows. A few went public, only to suffer the same fate as Lazar careers destroyed, families strained, reputations smeared. The pattern was hard to ignore. Those who claimed to know the truth about Area 51 rarely prospered. They found themselves harassed, followed, ridiculed, or silenced. Some simply disappeared from public view, their stories left unfinished. The desert itself seemed to swallow them whole, just as it swallowed the craft said to be hidden beneath its sand and stone. To this day, Area 51 remains shrouded in secrecy. Aircraft tested there are explained as cutting-edge but earthly in origin, the veil of national security draped across every rumor. Yet, the testimonies of Lazar and others linger like ghosts, too consistent to vanish, too strange to ignore. Whether he was a visionary truth-teller or a convenient pawn in a game of disinformation, one fact remains clear. Speaking about what lies inside those fences carries a cost. For the whistleblowers, the desert does not just hide machines, it hides lives undone by the weight of what they dared to reveal. In November of 2004, off the coast of California, the crew of the USS Nimitz carrier strike group found themselves staring into a mystery that would echo for decades. For days, radar operators aboard the USS Princeton tracked strange objects dropping from 60,000 feet to sea level in mere seconds, then vanishing again. These were not blips or technical errors. The contacts were confirmed by multiple systems, behaving in ways no known aircraft could. Commander David Fravor, a decorated Navy pilot, was dispatched along with his wingman to intercept. What he encountered that afternoon would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hovering just above the ocean was a smooth, white object, shaped like a giant tic-tac. It had no wings, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion. The water beneath it churned as though something massive lay submerged below. As Fravor's jet descended toward it, the object turned in an instant, mirroring his movements with uncanny precision. Fravor dove to cut across its path, but the craft shot upward, accelerating so fast it seemed to vanish. Moments later, radar operators reported it had reappeared 60 miles away, exactly at the pilot's pre-planned rendezvous point. The message was chilling. Whatever it was, it not only outflew them but seemed to know where they were going before they got there. The pilots returned to their carrier shaken, their voices caught between awe and disbelief. They had engaged something beyond human technology, a craft that bent the rules of physics as effortlessly as a child skipping stones. Yet when they filed their reports, the reaction was silence. There were no debriefings of substance, no follow-up investigations that reached them. The tapes and radar data, some said, were quietly taken away. Official channels gave no answers. For years, Fravor and the others who had seen the tic-tac spoke only in fragments, mocked or dismissed when they dared mention it. The Pentagon offered nothing but silence, treating the event as though it had never happened. Their careers were not destroyed outright, but the ridicule lingered. A few refused to speak publicly at all, unwilling to risk reputations built over decades of service. It was not until long after, when leaked videos reached the public, that the world finally caught a glimpse of what the Navy pilots had seen. Grainy footage of the tic-tac craft locked in a targeting camera reignited the story, forcing the Pentagon to admit the videos were genuine. But by then, the years of silence had done their damage. Witnesses had carried the weight of the encounter alone, their credibility questioned, their words doubted. For Fravor, the memory remains as vivid as the day it happened. A white object with impossible speed, intelligence, and purpose, something that reduced the most advanced jets on Earth to toys. The USS Nimitz incident stands as one of the clearest cases on record, and yet the men who saw it firsthand learned the same lesson as those before them. The truth in the skies can be undeniable, but speaking, it often comes with a cost that never fades. In the late 1940s, as reports of flying saucers flooded newspapers and military switchboards, the U.S. Air Force launched a series of programs to study the phenomenon. At least, that was the story given to the public. First came Project Sign, then Project Grudge, and later Project Blue Book. Of them, Grudge stands out not for its search for truth, but for its determination to bury it. Created in 1949, Project Grudge was announced as an official investigation into unidentified flying objects. The public was told that the Air Force was taking the sightings seriously, that experts were reviewing the evidence with an open mind. But inside the project's offices, the mission was far different. The goal was not to find answers, but to craft explanations that would strip the mystery away, no matter how strained or absurd. Witnesses came forward with stories of lights pacing their aircraft, of discs hovering above fields, of craft that left scorched marks on the ground. Pilots, radar operators, even military officers testified with precision. And yet, nearly every report was dismissed as stars, weather balloons, or imagination. The pattern became clear. The stranger the account, the faster it was discredited. For the men and women who had risked ridicule to tell the truth, the betrayal was crushing. Farmers who had sworn to what they saw found themselves mocked in the press. Airmen who had reported near misses in the skies were told they had mistaken planets. Even decorated officers were painted as unreliable, their reputations quietly eroded. The machinery of denial was deliberate and thorough. Behind the scenes, documents revealed the purpose. Project Grudge was not simply gathering data, it was shaping a narrative. Analysts were ordered to produce reports that reassured the public and deflected suspicion. The very name, Grudge, spoke to the contempt with which the subject was handled. To acknowledge the phenomenon as real was to risk panic, to risk questions the Air Force could not or would not answer. So instead, they built a wall of ridicule. Some within the program resisted. A handful of investigators admitted that certain cases could not be explained, that the objects in question displayed performance beyond earthly technology, but their voices were silenced or reassigned, their findings buried beneath layers of denial. Careers were broken, files went missing, and the weight of secrecy grew heavier with every report. By the time Grudge gave way to Blue Book, its damage was already done. Witnesses had learned that to speak openly was to risk their livelihoods. The press had been trained to treat the subject as a joke, and the public, hearing only dismissals, turned skepticism into reflex. Project Grudge was less an investigation than a weapon, aimed not at the skies but at the people who dared to look up. Its legacy was not answers but silence, a silence that stretched for decades, leaving behind only fragments of truth buried under the official sneer of disbelief. In the early 2000s, while the public was told that official interest in UFOs had ended long ago, a quiet program inside the Pentagon was following a different truth. Its name was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP, and for years it operated in the shadows, studying encounters that were officially dismissed, tracking evidence that others had laughed off. The program was funded with millions of dollars tucked into black budgets, hidden under titles so obscure that even most of Congress never knew what the money was for. The purpose of ATIP was clear to those inside it. Investigate the unknown craft that Navy pilots, radar operators, and ground witnesses continued to report. These were not random lights or rumors. They were objects caught on multiple sensors, performing maneuvers that shredded the laws of physics. Some accelerated at thousands of miles per hour, with no visible means of propulsion. Others hovered motionless against hurricane-force winds. Again and again, the data pointed to something beyond the reach of any known nation. But secrecy came with a cost. Those involved in the program walked a thin line, forced to bury their findings in classified files while watching the world outside dismiss the very idea of UFOs. They gathered evidence of strange materials, studied military encounters, even briefed officials at the highest levels, yet the information rarely escaped the walls of the Pentagon. For many, it was a prison of truth. Then, in the year 2017, the silence cracked. A series of leaks brought the world face to face with grainy but undeniable footage. Navy gun camera videos showing objects now known as the Tic Tac, the Gimbal, and the Go Fast. Each clip captured craft performing impossible feats, and each was confirmed by the pilots who had chased them. Suddenly, What had once been ridiculed was splashed across front pages. The Pentagon, pressed by journalists and lawmakers, was forced to admit that AATIP had been real, for the insiders who had risked everything to bring the truth forward. The revelations were both victory and punishment. Some lost their clearances, their careers derailed for speaking too openly. Others endured ridicule, accused of exaggeration or seeking fame. Yet what they had revealed could not be buried again. The world now knew that the U.S. government had never truly abandoned the UFO question. The ATIP story was more than just a leak. It was a fracture in the wall of secrecy that had stood since the 1940s. For the first time, military witnesses were allowed to speak without immediate ruin. Lawmakers began demanding briefings. The subject crept from late-night radio into the halls of Congress. But for the men and women who carried the secret for years, the cost remained heavy. Some paid with careers, some with peace of mind, but all carried the same truth. That disclosure was never given freely. It was wrenched from the shadows, at a price. In September of 2001, just one day before the world's attention was consumed by tragedy, the Secretary of Defense made a startling admission. He told the nation that the Pentagon could not account for over $2 trillion. The announcement should have sparked outrage and endless investigation, yet within hours it was forgotten, buried beneath the smoke of falling towers and the shock of war. For those who paid attention, the timing was almost too perfect. Over the years, whispers grew louder that some of that untraceable fortune had not been lost, but hidden, channeled into black projects, so secret that even members of Congress were left in the dark. Among the most persistent rumors was that vast sums had been funneled into research connected to UFOs. Not just studying sightings, but reverse engineering craft, building underground facilities, and attempting to replicate technologies that bent space and time. Whistleblowers came forward in fragments. Contractors spoke of budgets that defied explanation, projects that operated without oversight, labs tucked into deserts and mountains where something unearthly was being studied. Some claimed they had seen fragments of crashed disks, metals that defied known science, even propulsion systems that could not be explained by human engineering. They said the money flowed like water, endless and unmarked, vanishing into programs that officially did not exist. But those who spoke rarely lasted long in the public eye. Some were discredited, their backgrounds scrubbed or twisted until they looked like fabricators. Others faced sudden career collapses, bankruptcies, or the quiet ruin of their reputations. A few simply disappeared, their names remembered only in scattered testimonies and late-night radio archives. The pattern was consistent. Reveal too much, and you would not be allowed to keep speaking. For the public, the missing money remained an abstraction, a number so vast it was easier to forget than to comprehend. Yet for those who believe the funds were directed toward UFO research, the implications are staggering. Trillions could fund fleets of hidden craft, networks of secret bases, entire sciences conducted beyond the reach of universities and peer review. It could explain why sightings persist decade after decade, with no official acknowledgement of progress. The truth may not be that nothing is known, but that too much is known, hidden behind walls of unaccounted billions. Officially, the Pentagon continues to wrestle with what it calls financial discrepancies, a polite term for oceans of money that cannot be traced. No records point directly to UFO research, no documents admit the connection. Yet the silence, the secrecy, and the fate of those who tried to speak suggest otherwise. For the witnesses who believe, the missing money is not just a scandal of corruption, it is the hidden ledger of humanity's greatest mystery. And the cost of revealing it has been paid, time and again, by the disappearance of voices brave enough to follow the trail. From the very first wave of sightings in the late 1940s, the official response to UFO reports carried a pattern more dangerous than silence. It was ridicule, sharp and deliberate, aimed like a weapon at those who dared to speak. Farmers who described discs above their fields were painted as country fools. Pilots who risked their lives in the skies were told they had mistaken Venus or reflections on glass. Even decorated military officers were treated as if they had lost their grip on reality. The message was clear: speak of what you saw, and you will be laughed into silence. This ridicule was not accidental. Declassified memos from the 1950s reveal that intelligence agencies actively encouraged skepticism and mockery as tools of control. By turning the UFO subject into a joke, they ensured that credible witnesses would hesitate before opening their mouths. What better way to bury the truth than to make it absurd in the public's mind? A pilot afraid of being grounded, a policeman afraid of losing credibility, a civilian afraid of being called crazy, all became their own censors. The effects were devastating. Many witnesses described feeling isolated, not only from their communities but from themselves. They began to doubt their own memories, replaying the sighting in their minds until fear twisted it into uncertainty. Some withdrew into silence, never speaking of it again. Others tried to push forward, giving testimony to researchers or journalists, only to be met with smirks and headlines that turned their lives into spectacle. For some, the humiliation was worse than the encounter itself. The stigma machine reached into every corner of society. Newspapers ran cartoons mocking flying saucer reports. Television shows portrayed witnesses as wide-eyed eccentrics. Even within families, confessions of sightings often brought laughter instead of comfort. Children grew up hearing their parents called liars. Careers ended quietly as employers decided a man who claimed to see lights in the sky could not be trusted with responsibility. And behind it all, the intelligence community smiled. They had no need to suppress every report when ridicule did the work for them. By poisoning the subject with scorn, they turned truth into madness and witnesses into exiles. Yet, the scars remain. Many who endured the ridicule carried it for life, their encounters locked away as secrets that could never be shared. Some died without ever telling anyone beyond a small circle of trusted friends. Others whispered their stories on deathbeds, their voices trembling not from age but from decades of fear. The stigma machine worked with ruthless efficiency, but it left behind a haunting truth. If ridicule was so necessary, if mockery had to be sharpened into a weapon, then perhaps the thing it sought to bury was not foolishness at all. Perhaps it was evidence fragments of a reality too heavy to be carried in the open. And so the laughter that echoed across decades was not the sound of truth revealed, but of truth smothered, leaving silence in its place. Across decades of UFO encounters, one pattern stands out like a shadow stretching behind every story: the sudden disappearance of evidence. Photographs, radar logs, physical samples, even official reports, all vanished as if swallowed by a hidden hand. Witnesses, already shaken by what they had seen, were left defenseless, their credibility shredded because the very proof they clung to had been erased. In the early 1950s, a small-town sheriff collected fragments of metal after a glowing object crashed into a pasture. The pieces were unlike anything he had ever seen: light, strong, resistant to fire. He placed them in a locked evidence box, but by the following morning, the box was gone. When he asked his deputies, none claimed to have touched it. Days later, 2 suited men arrived, not from his county or even his state, and warned him never to speak of it again. The pasture grew quiet, but the sheriff's life never did. Stories like his ripple across history. Air Force radar operators in the 1960s recorded blips of unknown craft that darted across their screens at impossible speeds. They saved the logs, certain that finally there was proof. But before their next shift, their commanding officer informed them the records had been reclassified. When they asked to see them again, they were told the logs had never existed. Some of those men never spoke of UFOs again, not because they stopped believing, but because they realized belief meant nothing without evidence to back it. Even civilians found their keepsakes stripped away. Families who snapped photographs of glowing discs often saw strangers at their doors within days. Cameras were inspected, film rolls removed, prints confiscated under vague claims of national security. To the world, it looked like the photos had never existed. To the witnesses, it felt like a piece of their lives had been stolen. Perhaps the cruelest cases came when medical evidence vanished. In the 1980s, a woman in the American South was hospitalized after reporting close contact with a strange object. Doctors noted severe burns on her skin, consistent with radiation exposure. Blood tests were taken, results filed. Then, without explanation, the charts disappeared. The woman's condition worsened, her credibility evaporated, and she died never knowing why the truth she carried in her own body had been erased from the record. The vanishing files left more than just holes in archives. They left scars in the minds of witnesses, teaching them that even when they tried to protect themselves with proof, it could be stolen. Fear grew, not just of what they saw in the skies, but of what followed them afterward, the quiet steps, the missing documents, the sense that someone was always one step ahead. In the end, the vanishing files were not just about secrecy, they were about control. By stripping away the evidence, governments ensured that every story remained just, that a story, dismissed, doubted, and forgotten. And so the witnesses were left not only with their trauma, but with the hollow ache of knowing their truth had been erased before the world ever had the chance to see it. The aftermath of UFO encounters has rarely been just about what was seen in the skies. For many witnesses, the true horror came afterward, in the form of wounds that never fully healed. Radiation sickness left bodies frail, skin scarred, and organs weakened. Post-traumatic stress haunted sleep, filling it with flashing lights and impossible sounds. Careers that once carried pride and stability collapsed under ridicule and whispers. For those who came forward, the price was often paid in pieces of their own lives. Consider the rancher near Roswell, who dared to speak of wreckage scattered across his land. He was laughed at, intimidated, and watched until his neighbors avoided him. He died a quiet man, long before his time, carrying bitterness like a secret weight. Soldiers who had touched the same wreckage described rashes and strange illnesses in the years that followed, yet their complaints were ignored. Some wondered if what they carried inside them was poison from the stars or simply the consequence of silence. In the 1980s, a Texas mother and her young son reported being scorched by a blazing craft above the highway. Their skin blistered, their hair fell out, their bodies weakened. Medical bills piled high, but no agency would accept responsibility. When they pursued justice in the courts, their case was dismissed. They spent the rest of their lives fighting sickness and despair, abandoned by the very institutions sworn to protect them. Even those who survived without physical burns often bore psychological scars. Pilots who once ruled the skies with steady hands began doubting their own senses after being told what they saw was a mirage. Some turned to drink, others to silence. Families fell apart under the strain of ridicule. Children watching parents crumble under the burden of secrets they were never meant to carry. The paranoia was perhaps the cruelest wound of all. Witnesses spoke of cars following them for miles, phones clicking with phantom echoes, strangers standing too long at their fences. Whether real or imagined, the fear was constant, and it seeped into their lives until trust itself became impossible. Friends distanced themselves, colleagues whispered, and communities pointed fingers. The witnesses who had once felt part of the ordinary fabric of life found themselves unraveling at the edges. The cost of speaking out was more than embarrassment. It was health eroded, dignity stripped, and years stolen. Some carried their stories to the grave, whispered only in the dark to loved ones who never knew whether to believe. Others faded into obscurity, remembered only as cautionary tales of what happens when you tell the truth too loudly. The lasting wounds remain, invisible scars etched across decades of secrecy. Behind every famous sighting, Every radar blip, every classified file, there are human beings who paid in flesh and mind for what they saw. And when the world debates lights in the sky, those lives, their suffering, their silence, their pain are too often forgotten. Through every decade, one thread binds the stories of those who dared to look up. The cost. The skies offered them a glimpse of something beyond explanation, a sight that shattered the ordinary world they knew. Yet, instead of wonder, they found themselves carrying a burden that few could imagine. They bore not only the memory of impossible lights and impossible craft, but the punishment of speaking aloud what they had seen. Some were believed too much and suffered for it, branded as dangerous or unstable. Others were not believed at all, left isolated, mocked, and forgotten. The rancher, who found wreckage in the desert, the pilot who watched his instruments fail in midair, the family whose bodies burned from an encounter they could not outrun, each carried scars that lasted a lifetime. The government's silence was not passive. It was sharpened into a weapon, a blade of ridicule, intimidation, and denial that cut deeper than the sighting itself ever had. Fear was the constant companion of witnesses, fear of being followed, fear of being silenced, fear of being left alone with an experience too large for words. And yet, through all the shadows, the question lingers like a whisper in the night. Why? Why keep the truth buried? If the lights in the sky are nothing but illusions, why erase files, silence testimony, and discredit lives? If the encounters are without meaning, why ruin the men and women who dared to speak of them? The answer remains hidden, locked away in vaults of secrecy, and swallowed by programs that deny their own existence. What is left are the voices scattered, fractured, and yet undeniable. They echo from Roswell's dusty plains, from the dark forests of England, from the silent skies above deserts and oceans. They remind us that the unknown has never left us, that it hovers at the edge of our vision, daring us to see. For the witnesses, the greatest punishment was not the ridicule, nor even the sickness, but the silence imposed upon them, the erasure of their truth. The price of looking up was heavy. It took lives, families, and peace of mind. It twisted careers into ruin and left shadows across generations. And still, the skies remain. Still, people glance upward at night, waiting for a flash of movement, a light that does not belong, a reminder that the story is not finished. The truth has not disappeared. It has only been hidden. Perhaps one day, the silence will break. Perhaps the burden carried by so many will finally be lifted, and their stories will be heard not as tales of madness or mistakes, but as warnings, as testimonies, as truths long denied. Until then, the question remains. When the world finally demands to know what waits above us, what price will we all pay for daring to look up?